this is the problem we're trying to solve, which is those patients who are battling serious disease are having the hardest time getting the medication they need because of the broken system. So we're trying to make a difference there. And our HouseRx vision is to try to decentralize this specialty pharmacy experience. So right now you have 4 companies that are all insurance companies that own 88%. 88 is 4 companies. I just want to underscore that of the market, which means that there isn't actually real choice of providers.
And now, from San Francisco and the UCSF Rosenman Institute, the Health Technology Podcast with your host, Christine Winoto.
We all know that waiting in line for your medication can be a slow and frustrating process. But with the rise of specialty pharmacies, we are beginning to see faster and easier access to certain medications. Co-founder and CEO of HouseRx, Ogi Kavazovic, is here with us to explain the inner workings of this $250 billion plus market. With 20 years of experience working in tech startups, Ogi sees how technology can fix what he calls a broken system of patients receiving access to expensive medications. Today, I asked Ogi about his journey into health tech and his vision for the future of specialty pharmacies. Here's our conversation. Welcome, Ogi. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
It's so exciting to have you. And I thought it would be good for our listener to hear a bit about your background. And I just thought it's interesting that you start your career not really in healthcare, but somehow you're solving the healthcare problem that we're facing. Maybe you can share with us your journey.
Yeah, I mean, so the connection between me and healthcare is the same as is the connection between startups and healthcare these days. It's so great to see that there's such a rich ecosystems of startup companies, technology and otherwise, that are trying to make healthcare in the U.S. and worldwide, but particularly in the U.S. better, and it needs to be better. And so that's kind of where I come into the picture. I happened to, I was a computer science major in college, and I just happened to be graduating during the first .com boom. And so instead of, whereas people who were 3 or 4 years, and this was in 2000, people who were 3 or 4 years ahead of me would have taken jobs at Microsoft and Oracle. Those are sort of the big software companies at the time that were gobbling up all the talent. When my generation was graduating, all of a sudden, this is a very new thing, these quote unquote startup companies, sort of even a new term back then, were gobbling up all the talent coming out from college. And so I was sort of part of that wave. I got gobbled up by a startup as the first engineer directly out of college. That was my introduction to corporate America. It wasn't that glamorous. It was a really sort of terrible office in Waltham, Massachusetts. There was a guy on the cheap. There were 2 other people there, and and they were trying to. I just started coding whatever they told me to code, and I was sort of starting to get exposed to corporate America that way. Fast forward 20 plus years later, I'm afraid to say, and I've done almost exclusively just startups throughout those 2 decades. I think once I really like the aspect of building something from scratch and the challenges that come with it and so forth. And so over those 20 years, I went from being an engineer, today CEO, but in between really went into product management and product marketing and those sort of disciplines that are adjacent to the hardcore engineering work. And so that was sort of my transition into the business side. So yeah, for better and worse, I've done nothing but startups my entire career. I'm familiar with failure in startups, which is definitely present as part of the game. And so I've also been lucky enough to have been part of a couple of pretty significant successes. One of the startups that I was in the founding team of went public back in 2014, and the more recent one got acquired as well for a large sum. And so those were sort of I've also seen what it means to go from concept all the way to a large company and then an eventual acquisition. So that's my background. And the latest startup was in healthcare. It was a company called Flatiron Health, where I was part of the executive team. And that was my introduction into healthcare. So I'm a relatively newcomer to the healthcare space. But I do bring that sort of startup experience on how to build a company, how to bring technology to bear to solve a problem. And after Flatiron got acquired, I started looking to sort of I became so interested in healthcare that I wanted to, I sort of made up my mind that I would, at least for the next startup, number 5 now, it would stay in healthcare and look for a big problem to solve there.
It is definitely addicting to be in healthcare, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a huge surface area. It impacts everybody at some point in our lives. It's easy to relate to on a human level. You can talk to sometimes when you have a really technical startup, your family, your friends don't understand what you're doing. In healthcare, there's this sort of, everybody sort of understands. Everybody goes to the doctor at some point, goes to the pharmacy at some point. So they sort of intuitively understand. So you feel like you're connected to a real problem experienced by real people. And that is motivating in itself, that you're not, working on, I don't know, no disrespect to to Facebook, but working on an avatar in the metaverse, but actually trying to, do something here and there, and that could affect people that and family members and so forth for the better. And so that it has an additional layer of motivation. So in that way, yeah, I agree. It is addicting. Is that feeling of having a real impact is really energizing.
I think in a way, yes. It's kind of, you see something that closer to, many people have experienced healthcare. And I think it feels very concrete, the impact, that easy to digest, I guess, like, oh, I make that impact because it's changing people's life. But I thought it was really interesting that, before you get to healthcare, you went to, you work for Schlumberger, which is very, oil's energy company, which is so different. But along the way, what are the things that you learn from all the different industry because oftentimes people go to healthcare coming from the different industry, there's always the difference. They feel like, oh, healthcare is so slow. And then when you go to healthcare, they try to speed everything up because the experience they have in the tech actually doesn't always work out that way.
Yeah, it's funny. I've definitely, as you mentioned, done a bunch of work in energy and in the oil industry, and also in the utility and gas industry, but by creating technology for those industries. I actually, for what it's, I'm maybe a little bit of a contrarian here, but I don't think healthcare is that different than as different as people think. From some of these other industries, you just have to kind of find a somewhat bureaucratic, a somewhat regulated industry, which there is no shortage of out there, and then it actually mimics healthcare pretty well. So, just as an example, I mean, right before I got into healthcare, we're at a startup that was selling to gas and electric utilities, like the likes of PG&E here and in San Francisco, and all over the country. And it's not that different than selling to a health system or selling to a insurance company. Local utilities are almost like local municipal governments in some ways, with many layers of leadership and processes and matrix organizations, and also heavily regulated. There's sort of these like layers of regulations, both at a federal level and at the state level and at the municipal level, in the case of utilities, that all interact with each other. So I get asked this question a lot. Like, when I first came to Flatiron Health, a lot of people are like, well, how did you make the transition? Healthcare is so special. I was like, well, actually, I came from an industry that had very, very complex state level energy efficiency regulation that we had to navigate. I came from a place that also used data and interest in a big data, quote unquote, to solve some of the some of the issues at hand. And I came from a place that had to sell into big organizations and navigate that sales process. So honestly, to me, when I first stepped foot into a healthcare company, it all looked familiar. There's a different, of course there were differences too, but there's a lot of familiar where there's a lot of the same playbooks that we had at the company Old Power that I'm alluding to before, Flatiron Health, around everything from sales to how to build product to how to do marketing in this type of environment, to having a regulatory team, how do they interact with the sales team. All of that was largely reusable in healthcare. So yeah, but then there were a bunch of healthcare specific things. I think the one thing you learn really quickly is sort of the high level of sensitivity and protection around people's health data. The fact that sometimes you're dealing with life and death situations, and that's not an exaggeration. I mean, we worked with cancer clinics and at Flatiron Health, and we were sort of right there working with the people who had patients who would pass away, routinely, of course, and sadly. And you sort of learn how to interact with that and how to absorb that in your day, in your work day, in your weekday, in your work week. That was new, and that was visceral. That's not something that really shows up in most other industries,
right?
So yeah, and then the additional level of protection and sensitivity around that, you sort of have this very additional level of respect for the profession and for the data for your customer, if they're a healthcare provider, or for the patient, of course. Either one, if either one of you is your customer, there's an additional level of respect and protection or protectiveness that you feel. So all of those things, all of those dimensions were, I think, new in healthcare. But again, you can, I think, to anybody listening that might be in a different industry or a different major or something like that might be interested in healthcare, chances are a lot of the knowledge that you might get from other industries can be applied.
This podcast is sponsored by Brown Rudnick's Global Life Sciences Group, a team of legal professionals that help life science companies, lenders, and investors around the world turn good science into good business. Learn more at brownrudnick.com. This podcast is also sponsored by Canon Quality Group. Canon Quality Group has been helping medtech startups set up quality management systems for over 10 years. If you're unsure when to get started with quality management in your startup, turn to the experts at canonqualitygroup.com.
And that's an interesting that you mentioned. I mean, there's a lot of similarity, familiarity. And one of the things that oftentimes people in healthcare, at least in the US, we like to think that in many other industry, people who pay for the service are the one who receive the service. And oftentimes in healthcare, it's not really the case.
Right. And the people who are paying for the service are not paying attention to what they're paying for. And what I mean by that, in particular in the U.S. healthcare system, I think it's in my opinion, it's the crux of a lot of the issue. Because if you think about it, so much of the healthcare is paid for by employers. And then if you look, and if you put aside some of the most sophisticated, very large employers like Walmart, for example, or Amazon, where they really get into bring a very sophisticated team to analyzing their healthcare spend. For most sort of middle part of the distribution of your employers, it is somebody, right? If you think about who actually makes this decision, it's somebody on the HR team, the people ops team, whose job is to do something else, probably. In most cases, they're sort of just part of the HR team, but once a year they need to do this somewhat annoying thing where just pick a healthcare plan for the employee population, and there are a bunch of brokers who come their way, and they're sort of don't understand half of the sort of mumbo jumbo that they tell them, and they just be like, well, what does everybody else pick, and let's just do that. And I have 7 other more pressing issues to get to today than obsessing whether I should go with United Health versus Cigna, and which plan, and what are all the different rules and so forth. And so they make a decision and they never think about it again. And that decision is incredibly consequential, because then it's that employer who's paying the bill. Mm-hmm. And so whatever shenanigans that might happen behind the scenes, like the people who are actually paying are not paying attention to them, because they just sort of assume that's a cost of doing business, and they pay whatever it is that they have to pay and move on. It's almost like a tax. And that's a real big problem. That creates an environment for abuse. Mm-hmm. Right? It's almost like you have like an uncle who sort of gives you a stipend and doesn't really pay attention to what you're spending it on, and there's no rules how to spend it, and so you just sort of go out there and who knows what you're going to use that money on. And that's kind of how I feel. But what can happen then downstream, mm-hmm. all the different players are trying to get a piece of that money that employers are just putting into this big fund.
Yeah, but although I have to say that many of the large company or many of the company now look at the cost of
it's getting better.
Is
increasing, and honest, in part because of there's now an entire ecosystems of startups who are employer facing. That was sort of like seems obvious today, but there was sort of like a new realization that some of the companies in the last decade or so have pioneered, which is, the traditional models, or if you're in healthcare, you're selling to the patient, or you're selling to a hospital, you're selling to a clinic, or you're selling to an insurance company, or maybe a pharmaceutical company. Those are your sort of options. And somebody at some point said, well, how about the employer? Selling healthcare services to the employer is an innovative thought, isn't it? It's not immediately intuitive. And companies like Lebongo and others who have done that really well have been tremendous, incredible successes. What a great idea! I'm an advisor of a company today called Spring Health, where they sell mental health services to employers. They're doing incredibly well, it is getting better, and that's because of the startups that are supporting them now. Employers, it's making the employers more sophisticated buyers of healthcare and hopefully pay attention. And in my opinion, is the more they pay attention, the better. And not just to the overall cost. There's so much nuance underneath in the overall cost. Sometimes if you don't pay attention, I'm giving you an example. If you don't pay attention, let's say a pharmacy benefit manager, which is part of your employer cost is what you spend on drugs for your employee base, and they'll say, well, as long as you pay us X dollars per employee per month, we'll take care of everything. So it's like black box. And so from an employer perspective, and then you have another pharmacy benefit manager come and say, well, we'll pay you, I'll use round numbers. We'll say we'll pay $100 per employee per month, and everything we take care of, employees will have all the drugs that they need for whatever they needed. And yours employees say, well, that sounds great. And somebody else will come in and go, we'll do it for $95. And then another one will say, we'll do it for $92. And, you say, okay, great, let's go with 92. And problem solved. Check, moving on to my next task of the day. But then if you don't look under the hood, if you had looked under the hood, what you learn is that actually, if what you get for that price is almost, something that we see, like, for example, very commonly in the pharmacy industry, which is there's no patient choice, there's no employee choice. So if you do want to have a particular drug, you have to fill it with a particular provider, which could be halfway across the country. So they have to FedEx the drug to you, and you have to call into a call center and go through a bunch of bureaucracy. So you're subjecting your employees to quite a bit of hardship by making a seemingly easy decision to go with that $92 plan, or any plan really has this feature. And so you really have to kind of look under the hood and look, okay, so what do I get? What does the employee, what does my member experience look like? And so forth. And that's not easy to do, because even if you ask those questions, then you have to know, okay, well, what is standard and what is not standard? What is market? What is reasonable to ask for? What is not reasonable to ask for? And so unless you like really take the time to educate yourself about a bunch of different things, you're not really in position to negotiate with these experts. And so they always sort of take advantage of that. And so, how do you solve that problem is a real tricky one.
I almost feel like if you're an employer side, you should hire somebody from the health plan side to be part of.
Yeah, and so there are these brokers, there are these health insurance plan brokers out there. There's an entire broker industry,
right,
just to your point, that has emerged specifically to solve this problem. And so there are a bunch of these brokers are going to come in and advise you. And the problem there is that there's all kinds of weird incentives behind the scenes.
Right. Always follow the money.
They'll follow the money, and then you'll quickly find out that they're not necessarily acting in your best interest, but in their own best interest, and those two interests are not always aligned.
Yeah.
So a broker, just like very simply, a broker generally is incentivized to sell you, the plan that has the best kickback or a commission plan back to the broker if they sell it.
Yeah.
Not the actual best plan for you, right? And that's just and it's not the broker's fault per se, right? Every actor in a system acts according to their best interest.
Right.
It's just that the system is off. They're doing the rational thing, which is, if you're a broker, healthcare insurance broker, you're trying to make as big of a commission that month to take home as you can. So you ask, what are the rules of the game?
Right.
How are commissions paid? And then I'm going to go every day and hustle and try to make as big of a commission as I can for myself and for my family. Like, they're not bad actors. They're just given the wrong rules of the game, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of examples of that all throughout the system.
Which brought me to my next question is about House RX and how do you maybe we can start with like what is House RX trying to solve, and what's the genesis of it?
Yeah, I alluded to it a bit in my PBM example, but there's particular, we're working in the specialty pharmacy space, and that that term doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people. So I can sort of explain it at a high level, but like the specialty pharmacy really is a euphemism for really expensive medication. In fact, the Medicare definition for specialty is any drug that costs more than, I think, $850 a month per patient. And then they change that number every year depending on inflation and so forth. But it also means medications that treat complex conditions like cancer and rheumatoid arthritis and Alzheimer's and sort of these are neurological disease, diabetes, and so forth. And so there's a big market. It's a $250+ billion market, and it has it's evolved to be a very strange market that leads to a really difficult patient experience. And that sort of the example that I alluded to earlier, which is if you're a part of your employer health plan and you are in need of a specialty medication, which by the way means you are probably battling a significant disease, you're going to have a very hard time getting access to that medication. And the reason is you don't have choice of pharmacy. What you'll quickly learn is that your insurance company will say, yes, we will pay for this drug as part of your insurance plan, but you can only buy it from us, insurance company, which is pretty remarkable. And then you say, well, how do I get it? Okay, great. How do I buy it? Well, not great, but you're like, okay, how do I buy it? And then they'll transfer you to some 1-800 number, and then you'll sign up on something, and then you have to jump through a million more hoops. And an average time, takes about 2 weeks before somebody will FedEx it to you from halfway across the country in a box with a bunch of ice packs in it, because a lot of this medication needs to be cold chain. And maybe you're there in your house when it arrives, maybe you're not. It's a whole problem. And so it leads to a lot of bad outcomes for patients, really frustrated patients. And this is the problem we're trying to solve, which is those patients who are battling serious disease are having the hardest time getting the medication they need because of the broken system. So we're trying to make a difference there. And our HouseRx vision is to try to decentralize this specialty pharmacy experience. So right now you have 4 companies that are all insurance companies that own 88%. 88 is 4 companies. I just want to underscore that of the market, which means that there isn't actually real choice of providers.
The price point is about the same too.
Yeah, it's all the same. There's no competition. And so our vision is to have, hopefully 88% of the market being controlled by 4,000, pharmacies all across the country. And that's at the highest level, and just have it be local, just like your CVSs and Walgreens of the world that are in every corner in every town, and you can sort of have choice and different options, and you can choose whether some people prefer Walgreens, some people prefer CVS for weird reasons. That doesn't exist in specialty pharmacy, and I think it needs to. I think everybody intuitively understands that it needs to. It's better for that competition to form. So we imagine a world where specialty pharmacies are everywhere, and in particular, the way we're going about it is actually not just everywhere, but being conjoined with specialty clinics.
Mm-hmm.
There's an infrastructure, and one of the most pragmatic ways to make this happen on a timeline that won't take 100 years, right, is to take advantage of existing infrastructure. And so there are thousands and thousands of specialty clinics all across the country existing. And we really like this model where, because of the existing infrastructure, but also because these are complex diseases, it makes sense that the application of medication is closely coordinated with sort of the medical treatment as well, the medical side of things. And so what HouseRx does is help specialty clinics add a specialty pharmacy and specialty pharmacy services as part of their offering to their patients.
So that means, like, for me as patient, I go to oncologist specialty practice, and then they give me a medication, like a cancer drugs, and I can just buy it online through your site, or there's a brick and mortar.
You can get it right there. No, you get it right there in the clinic. You can get it right there in the clinic. They have a sort of a physical space within the clinic that is a specialty pharmacy. They keep inventory there. They anticipate. We help them with all of that. We help them anticipate the inventory they would need based on their visitation schedule and based on what sort of the most frequently prescribed drugs. You can just pick it up right there and talk to the care team.
And the price will be lower compared to if I have my insurance.
Well, yeah, in most cases, I would say in most cases the price would be the same, and that the reason is that you can actually what the price in this case, because it's always insurance paid. They're really expensive medications. You're talking about multiple $1,000s, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars. Right. Nobody's paying cash. If they were paying cash, yeah, the price would be pretty low, but that almost never happens. What the price is, what your insurance company says is your copay for that particular medication, and it's predetermined by your insurance company. So it turns out that whether you do it this way or whether you have wait 2 weeks to get it shipped to you halfway across the country, your out of pocket will be exactly the same. So so there won't be and we're trying to over time influence. There's ways we think we can improve that in the longer run, and start working with our providers to prescribe lower cost medications. And so there's some formulary management things you can do to actually save money to the patients. But this is controlled by the insurance. But what you can do is for the same copay that you would have paid, this really suboptimal experience, you can get a really great sort of white glove experience with the experienced care team. The same care team is taking care of you in your sort of medical treatment of your disease. The same team that would be providing you with the medications that need and following up with you, make sure that you're taking it, teaching you how to take it. A lot of these medications, by the way, are self-inject medications. It's a really intimidating thing to just get online and come to your home and figure out how to, insert the syringe somewhere into your body. And so having a local team where you can go and talk to them in person. They can show you how to do it. And if you have any sort of apprehension about it, they can be there to support you and so forth. We think is very important.
What do you think about, now everybody's talking about the Mark Cuban pharmacy company. And actually, a friend of mine mentioned to me the other day that his father has cancer. And so his mother, they go to a very, very, the cancer center in East Coast that's really known. And so told his mother, I was like, well, you can take this medication. If you go the regular route, it costs $18,000. But if you go to this Mark Cuban pharmacy company, I think it's called, I don't remember, the Cost Plus
drugs. Yeah.
Drugs. It costs $36. $18,000 and $36.
Yeah. So.
And how do you view that? Like, how does that play with House RX?
So look, I think what I love sort of what Cost Plus is doing. We're very, very supportive of the fact that it exists and there's this additional option. I do think this example that you are bringing forward is a little bit of a marketing gimmick. It's not really accurate. And what's actually happening there is the 18. So there's a couple of different things happening. One is that there's an $18,000 brand name drug, and the generic version of it is might cost like, I don't know, in your example, I'll take numbers, as you said, at $30. And so if you prescribe the brand drug, certainly it may be this crazy, but nobody really does that. So if you actually compare generic drug to generic drug, the price that it's on Cost Plus drug and what it would be in any other pharmacy would probably be very similar. Probably be maybe Cost Plus sells it for $36 and some other pharmacy will have it for $50. That would be the difference, not $18,000 to $30. So they're kind of taking advantage of this general rule where wherever there's a generic version of the brand drug, you should just use a generic version. But they're not the only ones providing it. You can get a generic version of the drug anywhere. That's number one. And then the other dynamic that's happening is this difference between paid by insurance and paid cash by the patient, right? A lot of the times, you can go, if your insurance is paying, your copay will be $20. But if you look at the invoice to the insurance, it will say $18,000. And you could say, for marketing reasons, oh, well, that drug cost $18,000 and my insurance paid $7,980 and I paid $20 and I could have gotten it. So the real comparison to the patient should actually be, what did you pay out of pocket with your insurance versus what do you have to pay cash on Cost Plus? So, it's quite possible that comparison also be very similar.
Yeah. I need to double check with them. But I think that some of it probably there's a pre-authorization. You have to wait and then,
Right. So if you're a cash payer, you definitely, if you're a cash payer and don't have insurance and don't want to deal with it for whatever reason, then you want to get the lowest cost generic version of the drug, and Cost Plus is one of the best, for the drugs that do have on formulary. It seems to be one of the lowest cost providers out there. So it's great that they're out there as an option. But most people in specialty, I would say certainly fewer than 10%, maybe a lot smaller than that, I don't know off the top of my head, are not cash payers.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, I know we're like close on running out of time soon. I want to make sure that I ask the question. You have all this experience, you work at Flatiron, and now you're, running a company. What are the things that you did not know when you started that you learned along the way? And also areas that you learned before that, like, wow, now I know better because of the experience that I had.
Oh my God. So, the specialty pharmacies, I can sort of answer a couple of different ways. One answer is, and the specialty pharmacies space has been so fascinating to sort of peel the onion back on. I've spent countless hours and days reading through these different contracts between the various entities in the space, between the distributor and the PBM and the pharma company, all of these different big entities and how they interact with each other. It's just, the amount of learning there is there at the detail level is almost overwhelming. So I would say I didn't know anything. looking back now, how little I knew about specialty pharmacy when I decided to go after it was probably really helpful. Had I known then what I know now, I would have probably been very hesitant to get into it. So there is this like blissful ignorance and naivete that I think a founder kind of has to have at the beginning, and sort of optimism that comes from that naivete. That is a feature, not a bug. You just sort of have to decide, this is an interesting space. There's a lot of problems here. Whatever I think is true now is probably going to be not true. I'm going to learn that it's probably not true. A lot of the assumptions that I have now are going to prove to be false by the time I keep reading about it. But you just have to, and you have to be okay with it. You just have to make a bet on a space. And that's sort of in terms of unknown. There's like a long list of things that I've learned that we don't have time to get into here. But then in terms of things that I've already known that I'm bringing to bear, I think a lot of this is the first time I was always, I've been part of a leadership team. It's the first time I'm CEO, and I think a lot of I feel ready for the job in many ways because I've gone through all the different roles, the different companies. So I'm bringing, I'm as a founder in my 40s now. I feel like I'm bringing all the sort of past experiences, both from different industries and also different roles that I played, to bear into this new role. And that gives me a lot of, it gives me a good amount of confidence. That I think that's helpful. At least, in terms of like management structures and so forth, how do you run a technology company internally? Like, I don't have to sort of reinvent the wheel there. I sort of know how I would like the leadership team to be structured. I know how I want the internal processes to be. I know how I want the sales team to interact with the product team. All of that I can sort of not have to like figure out as I go. I could put existing playbooks and then focus all the energy and all the learning into this particular domain space, if that makes sense, and trying to get as smart as possible about this space.
I was just thinking, like, when, with all the experience, the past experience you have, you've seen example for the management structure that worked really well and not so well. I'm sure you learned from that. And
both ways.
Right.
Both equally valuable. In fact, I would argue it's more valuable to have learned what didn't work so well, so you avoid those mistakes. So avoiding mistakes is extremely valuable for startups because we make a lot of them, by definition.
Yeah,
it's all about like naive mistake after naive mistake for a startup trying to enter a new industry where you're playing against people who've been doing it for many decades. And so, given that, you want to at least avoid the avoidable ones, which is like getting your leadership team the wrong way, or like those things that you saw in the past.
So, give us some example of the things that you saw that was wrong, that you feel like this is not done well, that I definitely don't want to do it this way.
Oh my gosh, where to begin? I've seen. So I'll give you. We talked about leadership team for a bit, but I've seen a couple of different philosophies on this, where I've worked with founders and companies before where they believe only the founders of the company should be in charge of the company for as long as possible and make most of the consequential decisions, because when you hire kind of a senior leadership team, you start losing that control, or it gets diluted. And I think that's and some companies do it that way. They actually, I've seen companies not create a leadership team and just sort of have the one or two or three founders, depending on how many there are, kind of be the leadership team by definition. I think this is a significant mistake, because what you have to realize just on leadership is that the goal, I think that makes sense to some extent when it comes to like really important strategic decisions. At the end of the day, the CEO plus the founders get in a room and make a decision whether to sell the company, or make a big decision whether to acquire some company. Ultimately, those kinds of big consequential decisions will have to come down to one or two people at the end of the day. But most of the purpose of a leadership team is actually not to make those decisions, because they don't come up that often. Well, the purpose of the leadership team is to keep everybody rowing in the same direction. That's what like. If you want to have a company be very efficient and go forward very fast, what you want is every team to know exactly where you're going, and every day, and every week, and if everybody's synced up in their rowing and pointing in exactly the same direction, your boat will go forward at the maximum speed. But if everybody's rowing a little bit different direction, even your boat will zigzag, and you will not be moving as fast as you can. And that is a very difficult challenge. And in order to do it effectively, you actually need to involve a reasonably broad group of people. So you want to head up every significant function and department. Seems obvious, but sometimes in startups we examine everything at the core principle level. Like, every company has a leadership team, but you will go to startup and they'll be like, well, do we need a leadership team? What is the purpose of a leadership team? What is the history of leadership teams? And then we have a bunch of nerds like looking at the history of leadership teams and sort of develop their own opinion. That's just what we do at startups. And so a reasonable mind can actually ask this question. But, my conclusion has been definitely have a broad and inclusive leadership team, better than a small one, because their number one primary function or purpose is to keep everybody aligned. And the more people you have, if you get that leadership team aligned, and that takes repeated communication, repeated realignment, and then they will in turn keep all their teams aligned on those same objectives. And you will have a better chance of running fast and being more efficient than the big bureaucratic companies you're trying to disrupt.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, thank you for your time. And it's been really a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It's fun talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Health Technology Podcast. We want to thank our executive producer, Herminio Neto, and our podcast engineer, Andrew Rojek. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. The Health Technology Podcast is available on all major platforms.